Now we know what is static variables, static methods, right? Now let's try to expand this more. To simplify this, what I will do is I will remove the static method for some time, and I will also decrease this code. Let's only work with one object now. And here, see, normally when you work with variables, so now we know that this is an instance variable and this is a static variable, right? The name. Now to instantiate the instance variable, what we do? Of course, we can instantiate the variables from here, but then what if you want to instantiate the variable on this line? If you want to give some value, not instantiate, if you want to initialize the variable, what you will do? So basically, we have seen one concept, right, which is constructor. So using constructor, we can say, okay, public mobile, and we can give some default values to it, right? So by default, the brand will be empty string, and by default, the price will be, let's say, $200, right? So this is the default brand, default text and default number, right, which we want to give. What about name? I can also give a default name to a name, which is phone in this case, let's say. And we can do that. We can initialize the static variable inside a constructor, and there's no harm in that. Now the problem is, every time you create an object, every time you create one more object, it will call the constructor, right? And don't you think it makes sense for this to initialize every time? But why name has to initialize every time? I feel that the name variable, which is static, should be initialized only once. What do you feel? Of course, the same thing, right? How will you do that? So if you mention that here, of course, every time you call the constructor, it will initialize. We don't want to do that. Now to achieve that, we have a special block called a static block. Now in this static block, we can basically initialize the variable, the static variable. Now the good thing about this is, the static block will be called only once. Irrespective how many objects you create, it will call the static block only once. So what I will do is, just to demonstrate that, I will create one more object here, let's say, and I will not assign any value to it, just to default values, obj2, second object. So it will call the constructor 2 times. It will call the static block only once. To prove that, what I will do is I will just print something. I will say in static block. Now the syntax for static block is very simple. It's static keyword, and then you just open and close. There's no bracket or something. It's just a simple block. Okay, and in the constructor as well, I will say in constructor. Okay, and now with this, let me just compile this code. Okay, there is an issue. I have written one extra. Okay, I have removed the curly brackets from here. So compile and run. So you can see it is calling the static block only once, and it is calling constructor 2 times. There is one more issue. Why static block is called first? Even before the constructor, it is calling static block, and that's weird. Is it the sequence? Let's try. Let me just put this after the constructor. Let's see if this does make any sense. Anyway, Java does not follow the sequence, but just to confirm, you can see the static block is still getting called first. Now to understand that, let's go to the diagram here. See what happens, there are 2 words and we only focus on one word. Every time you get the object, there are 2 steps. One, your class loads, and then your objects are, okay, so first your class loads and then your object gets instantiated. So there are 2 steps. Every time you create the object, there are 2 steps. Class loads and object will get initialized. The thing is, the class will load only once. So basically in your JVM, you have a special area here, which is called a class loader. Okay, and this will have all the classes which are loaded. And by default, of course, you don't have any class loaded, right? So the class will get loaded from your library to the class loader. And it will happen only once. So for the first object, when it sees, hey, there's object creation, it will load the class first, and then it will create the object. Now, every time you load a class, it will call the static block. Now, since class loading happens first, and that's why it will call the static block first, and then it will create the object, and that's why it will call the constructor after static block. Now, irrespective of how many objects you create, the class is already loaded, right? So you can simply create a next object without loading because it's already loaded. Now my question is, if that is how it is working, what if I don't create any object? I'm not creating any object now. So if you don't create the object, of course it will not call the constructor. But what about static block? It will not even call the static block. If you can see, we don't have any output. Oh, Okay, so that means if you don't create the object, it will not load the class as well. But what if you want to do that? What if you want to load the class? How will you do that? Now for that, we have a special class inside Java, which is called a class. Yeah, that's a class. Okay, I know. Java has been weird. We have object class, we have class, but that's how it is designed. So Java class, if you go there, you can see it's a class and it has a lot of methods to it. One of the methods which we want to use here is for name. Now for name is a method which does one thing, which loads your class. And you just have to mention your class name. What's our class name? The class name is mobile. So in this, you can mention the class name. That's it. Okay, the only problem is it throws an exception. Okay, at this point, we have not talked about exception, but just ignore this line. We'll talk about this in detail later, once we start with the exception concept. But as of now, just to make it work, I'm just writing this line. Ignore it. What's important is the class.forName will load your class. If I go to forName, you can see forName is a method and it's a static method. So you can directly you can call this with a class name. And this particular method, do they have any definition mentioned? Okay, so it says the system class loader is used. So basically it will load the system class loader to load this class. Okay, so which class? Mobile class. Okay, so now if I just write this line, it will not create the object, it will just instantiate it. Compile, run, you can say it says in new static block. Okay, that means you're just loading the class. So basically that's how you load your class. You can simply use this line to load your class. Normally when you build a project, you don't actually use this feature. Yes, there are some situations where you use it. Example, when we start with JDBC, we'll talk about this one, but we normally don't use it. I'm just using this just to show you how to call a static block, how to load a class. Okay, I hope this video makes sense where we talked about static block. So static block is used to initialize the static variables. So that's it from this video in which we talked about static block. In the earlier videos, we have talked about static keyword, static variables, static methods. And yeah, that's about static.